Officer on deck! Officer on deck! Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, to be precise, host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And it's been far too long putting us together on the same screen, Lieutenant Colonel, and I'm very glad to be with you tonight, and I hope to be on your show reciprocally before too long. There's so many wars to talk about with you, it's difficult to know where to start. But as the current most likely source of nuclear war in the world, let's start with the Russia-Ukraine war. The invasion of Russia using NATO weapons, German tanks, NATO mercenaries, in Kursk of all places. You would have thought a German tank would have turned round and ran when it was asked to go to Kursk, the source of the greatest defeat in a tank battle ever, one which changed the course of the Second World War, but they are determined to make history repeat itself. What's your analysis of why they did that and how it's likely to end?
Well, I'll tell you, and by the way, I'm absolutely delighted to be on here. And should I address you as Mr. Galloway? I've never actually talked to a former member of Parliament before. I just want to make sure I get that right.
George is fine, and I'll call you Daniel if I may.
That's even better. Thank you for that. I'll tell you, it is from a military perspective, it is really puzzling, because the things that go into winning or losing battles, and especially winning or losing wars, when you look at it at the strategic level, are just off the charts in the favor of the Russian side here. And it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible for me so far to identify any militarily attainable objectives of this incursion into Kursk. Now, they caught Russia by surprise. Russia never thought that they would make an incursion into their country, mainly because it didn't make any sense that they would try to do so. So Russia had it lightly defended, because they realized that if you divert that much firepower and manpower into an attack into a country the size of Russia, that it's just going to be absorbed in there almost. There's no reason for it to think it's going to success. So when Ukraine did the unthinkable, they did make some initial penetration, and they have a fairly sizable amount of territory as far as it goes. But the problem is you can't keep it. And what are you going to accomplish with it? They claim that it's anywhere from to make Russia hurt so that they feel the pain of war on the Russian side, to get a better negotiating position, and to cause Russia to redeploy some of its troops from the Donbass, et cetera. Those things are just not going to happen. Number one, on the negotiating part, it's actually caused the exact opposite. Russia had in June, I think June the 14th, Putin said, here is my latest and probably final negotiating offer, which was the four oblasts that they had illegally annexed in 2022. And he said, we'll take those and Crimea, and you'll go back to yours as long as there's no NATO in Ukraine. We'll have a negotiated settlement and end the war. They actually said that. Well, now then, that which was the worst possible outcome for Ukraine since the negotiations had started is now off the table. And so now what Russia is saying, as of today, they're saying now that because of this incursion here, we're just going to win the war, however long that takes. And they do have the wherewithal to do it. So I think that ultimately, while this is making really good splashes on the Western media right now, all it's going to end up doing is sealing the defeat, the military defeat of the Ukraine side, because they don't have the capacity to turn the tide.
But they were encouraged by at least some Western governments. Some people claim there's a difference between London and Washington on this matter. And that's not impossible. There was a difference between Thatcher and old George Bush over the first Iraq war. This is no time to go wobbly, George, said Mrs. Thatcher. And it's, I think, also a credible argument that Britain has been the more belligerent of the two, UK, US, in Ukraine and indeed elsewhere. Some say that there's a difference, but it is undeniable that NATO personnel, albeit rebadged as mercenaries, NATO weaponry, including those famous German tanks, and the encouragement of Joseph Borrell, the former EU foreign policy chief, and the British government. All of those have actively encouraged this invasion of Russia, which means they're either fools or knaves. They're fools if they can't see what you can see, and others like Colonel McGregor can see, that Scott Ritter can see. They're either fools or they're knaves. They could see it, but encouraged it anyway. How do you read that?
Yeah, I do, and it's disturbing. If you're a fool or just stupid, that's one level of a problem. But if you're actually aware of what it's going to be and you go for and do it anyway because you may calculate that, well, it's going to hurt Russia, it's going to kill more Russian troops, and so anything that embarrasses Putin is good, so cool, let's go ahead and do that. But that comes at so much cost of blood to the Ukrainian people, which is one of the things that frankly animates and angers me more than anything else throughout this, is that the complete lack of concern about the cost on the Ukrainian people and land that our policies are having, because there is no rational military outcome for the Ukraine side. This will not turn anything around. If anything, it's going to hasten their loss. And for some people to be aware of that and to still support it because there is a temporary hurt on Russia, they're oblivious and quite frankly, fools of the highest order, because the net result will not be harm on Russia. It will be harm on the Western side. It will definitely be harmful for Ukraine side, but even our own side is going to be significantly damaged because just imagine, George, the net result of this. If things play out the way they almost certainly are going to with the Russian military victory, everything NATO and all of our combined efforts will have done for 2.5, possibly up to 3 years when this is all done, will have been failed and utterly defeated. And so that will make us look far worse than anything Russia did. Russia went from somewhere around 1 million active troops when the war started to now about 1.5 million. And now that they have a lot of combat experience, their weaponry is far more advanced than it was. Their ability to produce weapons is far higher than it was and far higher than ours is even now. So every way you want to look at this, we are harming our own national security and just decimating the Ukrainian people. It's terrible.
If I was in the Kremlin, I would not now stop this war until I had taken Odessa. I had taken the entire coastline and left a rump Ukrainian state landlocked. I would absorb Transnistria, and I'd make sure that the government in Kiev was, to use the Russian word, nash. It was ours. It's a Ukrainian government, but it's ours. And there'll be no NATO, and there will be no fraternization of any kind between the government in Kiev with NATO and with Western powers. That's how I see this war ending now. What about you, Lieutenant Colonel?
Well, that seems to be the most likely outcome. It is just anguishing for, aside from the reasons I just mentioned, but because it didn't have to be this way. I mean, we had a negotiated settlement in April of 2022 in Istanbul that would have been fairly generous to the Ukraine side, that would have kept them independent, that would have kept them in control of all those cities you just mentioned that very well may fall still in their control. There would be hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians still alive to this day, and instead the losses just keep piling up by the hundreds of thousands every single day. And so the likelihood, if what you described, is certainly in the realm of possibility for the Russian side. Whether they'll go and take all those things remains to be seen, because there is still a cost to that. But now then, that is the most likely outcome because of our policies continue to go down paths that are unsustainable, that are militarily unattainable, and that are just flat out foolish and self-defeating for our own side. That is why this is so hard for me to watch.
Yeah, self-harm. The whole thing is characterized by self-harm, if not suicide, for Germany and for the European economies. and for NATO itself. But let's switch gear, Colonel, if we may, because there are many people who think that finally the balloon goes up in the Middle East this evening. There's been a notice issued by the Iranian side. No one can fly on the eastern part of the country where the war material is. The whole thing's now in a state of heightened alert. It's now around 11 or midnight in Iran. It's about 11 or 10 in the evening in Israel-Palestine. Many people think that the balloon goes up tonight. What's your take on that? How limited is it credible to be? I heard Scott Ritter say earlier today that Iran will limit their action to a very painful series of actions, but not too painful. And under Russian guidance, have been advised to avoid civilian casualties, restrict the number of targets. In return, Israel will attack Iran back, but thanks to the new S-400 deliveries, the electronic warfare deliveries from Russia to Iran, no great strategic damage will be sustained by Iran, and that will be the end of this particular chapter. I don't myself see it that way, but I wondered if you did.
Yeah, ironically, that would almost be the best outcome if a tit and then a for tat ended this situation here. But I tell you, George, my worry is that that Netanyahu has been spoiling for a fight with Iran from the beginning. And if Iran does anything, that they'll use this as an opportunity to launch a full-scale war because he wants to draw the United States into it. You had a senior Israeli official give a public, open interview to Newsweek magazine last Thursday where they said, hey, war with Iran, war, not just a strike, but war is inevitable. So the United States should join with us now in some kind of preemptive strike. So that doesn't sound like the Israeli government is looking to just have a response, but they're looking to use this as an excuse to launch a war. And listen, I don't know what they're thinking either, because when you look at, again, strictly military balance, the Iron Dome is not this panacea that it's been painted in the public. It is definitely limited. And I assure you, if you've had the combination of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran, they have significant missile capacity that could absolutely saturate anything that the Israeli side could do, and they could suffer significant harm if it got into a full-scale war. Iran doesn't want war. They don't want a war with the United States. They don't want a war with Israel. They would prefer not to have one. But if you push them too far, they will respond, and they have the capacity to have a lot of damage done. And as you point out, one of the other problems with our Russia-Ukraine policy is that there is spillover now in the Middle East, and Russia could provide not just defensive capability, but offensive capability, which Putin has said that he is willing to do since we're providing offensive capability for the Ukraine side to fire into Russia. Now then you see this, compounding problems for us, because we could find ourselves in a war in the Middle East that we should never fight, and there is no easy way to win. I assure you, going to war against Iran, whether it's Israel by itself, U.S. by itself, or together, is a fool's errand that would be far worse than the Iraq war was that started in 2003.
Colonel, you mentioned there that they want to draw America into a war, which begs the question, who would run that war for the United States side? Plainly not Joe Biden, surely not Kamala Harris. Is there anyone in the White House? I mean, the lights are on, but is there anybody there in a war?
Well, I think that it would probably be Jake Sullivan would be the architect of anything that happened. But when we helped the Israeli side defend against the missile barrage, I think last April, when Iran attacked Israel in response to their embassy being destroyed, you had the senior U.S. military four-star general on site for the CENTCOM commander, Central Command, who was on site. And I don't know if he's still there now. I know he was again recently when earlier when they thought that such an attack from or a response from Iran may be coming. So I think that you would probably have the senior general on the ground to make very direct coordination. But as an American, I find that very problematic, and I don't hesitate telling people so, because we have no military treaty with Iran, and yet you have Secretary of State Blinken, again, a couple of days ago, emphatically saying, we will defend Iran, as though we have some sort of treaty with them, or as though the U.S. Armed Forces is an extension of the Israeli armed forces, and it's not. But that's how it's being used. And, again, for our side, the United States, we have a constitutional provision that only the Congress, not the president, can take the United States to war. And yet that's exactly what is on the brink of happening right now, because no one's even discussing it, much less authorizing it. And these actions by our administration to let our armed forces be used by Israel for their own purposes could get us sucked into war whether we want to or not. And there's nothing good about this and everything bad. It could go anywhere from bad to catastrophic for our side.
I watched the other day, I no doubt that you did, and it's with no schadenfreude that I raise it, but I saw hundreds of millions of dollars worth of American weapons being paraded by the Taliban at Bagram Air Base, where once we used to torture some folks, to quote Barack Obama. That weaponry was left when the United States government fled from Kabul like a thief in the night, leaving a treasure trove of weapons, even helicopters. Who knew the Taliban could fly military helicopters? Well, they can now, because I saw them flying over in the parade. This political class of yours, they say that war's too important to be left to generals or colonels. I think I'd trust a general. I'd definitely trust you, Colonel, before I'd trust these political leaders that presided over that kind of debacle. Did you see the parade? Is it a chastening thought that the United States hasn't won a war since 1945 and didn't even actually win that? It was won by others. Does that ever cross the mind of the political class?
No, it doesn't. It's for me, who had 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, it was very painful and remains so because of how avoidable it was. I started publicly in 2009 talking about how we would lose this war if we didn't start making some changes. Of course, it was ridiculed at the time of anybody, how ridiculous that the Taliban would ever defeat the U.S. And yet that's exactly how it turned out, because it wasn't any kind of brilliant idea I had. It was just I was willing to look at things as they were, and the military fundamentals that at play and the political fundamentals. And they played out exactly the way one would expect if you weren't looking at it emotionally. But our political class doesn't look at it that way. They don't look at the military realities because, frankly, most of them don't know the military realities. Like Lindsey Graham, one of the biggest mouthpiece that you always see with a microphone on his face in the U.S. side, just absurd in the things that he says, has no idea how military things work, but that doesn't stop the camera from going into his face every time tomorrow, and he'll ask again. They're not concerned about that. They're concerned about temporal gain and how can I make this speech? It's going to get me some kind of political gain here, and then we'll worry about the consequences later. But you see that because the loss in Afghanistan didn't affect anybody in the United States, it was an embarrassment for some. Most people didn't pay any attention at all. They just went on about their business. These situations, because of the pattern that's been set there, these situations in the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Hamas war, and potentially now adding to Iran, these are very different, because this could cause significant consequence and harm to our country, to our armed forces, and to our standing around the world. But the mentality of the people that are in charge don't know that, because they think that we're the greatest power on earth. President Biden on Monday in a speech in Chicago, again, made this statement, you know, we're the greatest leader in the world and we're winning everywhere and the world is better for it, oblivious to the fact that almost the opposite is true, but yet that's the mentality that's animating him and many like him. And so when you see things that are physical and real like this, which could go very bad in a painful direction, and you hear these comments coming out, you can't help but really worry that we're going to run off a cliff one of these days.
Well, I can assemble and disassemble an SLR wearing a blindfold. I don't think Lindsey Graham could, or Kamala Harris, for that matter.
George, he couldn't spell SLR, I don't think.
Davis.
Thank you very kindly, sir. Appreciate it.
Absolutely right. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, on which I shall soon be making a return appearance. Deeply grateful to you, sir. I salute your sagacity. Thanks for joining us.